Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. With today's briefing, here is retired Marine Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. It has been a busy couple of days, and actually I was putting this together before, and things happened so fast in the Persian Gulf that we actually had to scrap it and put out a new one. So welcome. We're going to talk about our strategic risk assessment talk. Is going to talk about some of the strategic calculus, some of the implications of Iran's current actions, kind of give some context to not just the fact that there are strikes beginning again, U.S. strikes against Iranian targets, Iranian strikes in response to that, but actually our strikes were in response to what Iran was doing. Anyway, I'm going to try and give that some context, explanation, why there are much broader implications across the board of what Iran is doing and why the U.S. is having to completely reassess this. I can tell you right now that when the president basically is saying that the other side are nothing but liars and he's referring to them as scum, which was, frankly, I think the first time I've heard a president describe the other side in that particular term. It does tell you that there's extreme frustration with the Iranian side of this, the Revolutionary Guard Corps side. And it does sound, it's come up over and over again, that they agree to something on the table. We think we have an agreement with them, and then they just turn around and do something completely different. And in fact, the moment they get back, they will publicly claim that they never reached such an agreement. And, whatever you can say about, one side says this, the other side says that, this has come up so many times. And it is so clear that the MOU that they signed was not being adhered to. It does tend to lend a extremely high degree of credibility to this practice by the Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Iranian regime of saying and agreeing to one thing and then turning around and doing a 180 the moment they walk away from the negotiating table. So that's part of it. Well, let's do a quick review here. February 28th, the U.S.-Israel kicked off this air war against Iran. It lasted until really at a high kinetic op tempo until April 8th. And then after that, on June 11th, began this MOU 60-day negotiation period. All right. The MOU set forth a number of things, but within there, it says that Iran is supposed to allow free transit through the Strait of Hormuz and allowing commercial shipping to move through this unhindered. And on that part, they have never really stepped up and done this. Iran fundamentally has not complied with that stipulation. They have used all sorts of things to include gunboats and drones to attack ships trying to transit. This may not seem like a big deal, but when you get into the Strait of Hormuz, it's so narrow in certain areas that even though it's a internationally recognized sea lane, there are established lanes by the IMO, the International Maritime Organization. It's certainly things in compliance with the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, that when you go in there and you look at it, it's not unambiguous at all. I mean, it's not ambiguous at all as to what lanes are allowed for international shipping. All right. However, because they're so close, they're either in Iranian waters or Omani waters at certain points. Iran has been conducting attacks on shipping going strictly through Omani territorial waters. And that may not seem like a big deal because you say, well, international shipping is supposed to be allowed. However, what Iran's doing is routinely violating the territorial sovereignty of the sovereign waters, the territorial waters of Oman in these attacks. And I don't think that is something that has not been talked about much in the news, but I do think it is significant that they do this. So they've just basically not been compliant. Iran, at least clearly during the 60 days, not supposed to impose any charges, which include tolls, fees, anything like that. Consistently, they've been trying to figure out some way to get around that. They like the idea of being able to use the Strait of Hormuz as a toll station, and there have been estimates that they think they could raise up to $60 billion a year by putting exorbitant tolls on ships having to use the strait. This is so anything they do to force ships to go up through Iranian waters, anything like that, is a violation of both the intent and the practice of what this MOU is supposed to achieve. Ships that don't use the northerly route, as I mentioned, through Iranian waters are just regularly being targeted. That is their thing. And really what has pushed this is that this week we saw the Iranians attack 3 ships. At least 2 of them were tankers. One of those tankers was an Qatari LNG tanker, liquefied natural gas. Liquefied natural gas, if it explodes, it's not a small nuke, but it is a very, very powerful explosion. It's one of the most potentially one of the most powerful non-nuclear devices that could ever explode. And they set fire to that thing. They evacuated the ship because they were afraid that ship could explode. So this is something that has been, in terms of commercial shipping through the strait and what's going on, this has almost been kind of a sum of all fears. There is a tremendous amount of liquefied natural gas that comes out of the Persian Gulf, and here they have been so reckless as to attack one of those tankers when it was going through Omani waters and actually set it on fire. And I think that this was a turning point, not just for the U.S., but a turning point for a number of the Gulf states looking at this, saying this thing with Iran is simply not working. And nobody has quite come out and said, we need to put regime change back on the table. But if you listen to what President Trump was saying, it sounds like it's very much we're looking at that as maybe the only way to get past this is that the regime has got to go. We haven't said that yet formally. In fact, we went about leading up to the MOU. We were very, very clear that and saying that regime change was not one of our goals. But when you listen to the way he described the regime, certainly in Ankara during the NATO conference, it's not a huge leap to that conclusion. Let's just put it that way. Now, there isn't a big desire for the United States to return to full-on kinetic warfare. There certainly isn't a desire by the Arab states of the Gulf to see a full-on kinetic warfare. They realize they're vulnerable. They realize they have critical infrastructure in gas, oil, and water that is very vulnerable. So they don't want to see this thing turn into a big shooting war. They also recognize that Iran has recharged some of its stocks of drones and missiles while the non-kinetic post-April ceasefire period has been going on. So they're very concerned about that. But on the other hand, if they can't get the Strait of Hormuz operating and they can't export that oil and natural gas, what purpose is there in having a ceasefire? That's the other side of this thing. So a really, really difficult situation. There are multiple reports the Gulf states have been looking at the U.S. security guarantees because of entering into this MOU, and they had been talking to the Iranian regime separate apart. However, since those talks began, Iran has targeted Kuwait. They have targeted Bahrain. They have targeted a tanker from Qatar. And certainly you start to look at it and you go, all the Gulf states are sitting going, at this point, what are we getting from this? And now the Gulf states have been kind of licking their wounds from the attacks that were taking place on their critical infrastructure from missile strikes and drone strikes during the war. And there was a perception that the U.S. really wasn't going to be staying there forever, that our security guarantees were not as strong as they used to be. At least that was certainly the perception throughout the Gulf states. I don't know that this latest resurgence of kinetic strikes is going to change that perception. I don't know if they're going to try and reach a separate accommodation with Iran. I'm kind of wondering which way this will go. Nobody's overtly saying that, but many times in the Middle East, what's said on this level is not what's being said on this level. And so it's the real discussion that's taking place, away from the cameras, away from the open sources, if you will. That's where the real decisions are being made. The U.S. has been talking about moving our military bases in the region away from the Persian Gulf area, moving them further inland. And certainly for Gulf states like Oman, well, we don't have any bases in Oman, but Gulf states like UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, they have to be looking at this saying, well, we are on the Persian Gulf. So if they're going to move the bases further inland, maybe we could go further north in Kuwait but there's nowhere to go in Bahrain. There's nowhere to go in the UAE. There's nowhere to go in Qatar. So they would be saying the U.S. bases may be leaving, and they're going to determine whether the risk they currently incur from hosting those bases is really worth it if the U.S. is planning on pulling out anyway. So that's one part. For Saudi Arabia, this issue is huge. They're the only country that spans all the way from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf, and they were targeted heavily by Iran, so they are weighing this in many other ways. The thought was that they might eventually join the Abraham Accords. I think that's a little bit further away now than it was before, a lot bit further away now than it ever was before. And the U.S., before this latest string of kinetics, before the latest statements by President Trump, it looked pretty clear that we're just using it as a short-term strategy to buy some time, get a lot of oil, natural gas, other things rolling out of the Persian Gulf, open up the Strait of Hormuz, fill up those oil reserves around the world because they were getting so low. At one point, they were down to 30 days of low reserves, and in some places they were very concerned they might get down to zero. Also, to get the price of oil down, it was getting down to around $70 a barrel, and it looked like it was heading down to $60 a barrel in the coming months. Now it's pushed right back up. It's getting closer. It's in the upper 70s, pushing up to $80 a barrel now. But we did see some rather dramatic price decreases. We saw the stock market resurge the other direction. But now with strikes happening, we saw the exact opposite. Price of oil went back up. Stock market was depressed. And so the reverse correlation. So a lot of things that we have to look at with this. Now, Iran has been hosting this funeral for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That's the father of the current supreme leader, who was the supreme leader, who was killed in the opening strikes on February 28th. And speakers have been openly calling for the assassination of President Trump during this period of mourning. Interestingly, President Trump was over in Turkey for the NATO conference, certainly a very interesting NATO conference, to say the least. However, he flew in on the Qatari-supplied 747 that they've been retrofitting, that's all luxurious. It's a larger 747, and he was very excited about that. But he gets over there. That is not a 747 that was designed from the wheels up as Air Force One. Air Force One has a lot of different things in it that are not public, particularly things aimed towards air defense. It was widely believed this plane would not have all the air defense features that the regular Air Force Ones do. And sure enough, they swapped he's flying back on one of the older Air Force Ones. You can speculate all you want on that. It's just been retrofitted. I don't think it's a maintenance issue. Everyone looking at this seems to think, or at least most looking at this seem to think, that he perceives there's a threat to his aircraft, and he would rather be on the Air Force One that can actually defend itself in the sky. So that tells you something about this. These are not just rhetorical statements made at this funeral procession thing. These are things that we're listening to very closely. There's also been calls within senior members of the regime, the Iranian regime, to keep uranium enrichment, to not basically making it very clear they don't intend to really negotiate to get out of the uranium enrichment thing, and to keep the enriched uranium they have. And of course, this is our primary stated reason for being in this war to begin with, was to stop them from getting nuclear weapons. So in that regard, they're saying all these things, and keep in mind, this is an autocratic society. It's not like people get up there and get to express their First Amendment free rights, particularly if they're members of the Iranian regime. They're saying things that they want them to say. Now, the Houthis have also been active again. There was a small boat attack against a British ship in the Red Sea near Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That's that other big critical maritime choke point. That's the thing where you go up the Red Sea to the Suez Canal back and forth. It's absolutely essential for traffic going from Asia up through into the Mediterranean up to Europe. And so they're back active again, trying to intercept shipping. Fortunately, it was not a successful thing. But it does say that the Iranians who have control of the Houthis are trying to not clog up just one critical waterway, but trying to take control of two critical waterways in that regard. And so for shippers around the world, they're seeing this as a significant threat. All right. So the fear is that this could usher in an era where what we consider the truly free trade environment, where global commerce resting upon maritime capabilities, maritime commerce upon the seas, is now threatened by all these nations trying to control these critical waterways, whether it's the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb. Some fears have recently been voiced about what could happen in the Strait of Malacca, that these waterways will not be open to shipping like they are now. That would, if they put tolls in those areas, obviously, aside from all the changes to international maritime law and international law, it would drive up the cost of goods sold. It would decrease the advantage of global economy and manufacturing overseas. There's a lot of things that this would do across the board. So now, one of the things I should mention is the U.S. attacks have hit a variety of targets across the Persian Gulf on the Iranian side, obviously, hitting coastal radars, drone locations, missile locations. Of note, I saw a report that said that we had taken out 60-plus gunboats. Now, they have hundreds of these gunboats. I think before the war, they estimated the Revolutionary Guard Corps may have up to 1,500 of these gunboats. But we're going after these gunboats in a significant way. So I think that's something that I was kind of waiting to see happen. So that's fairly significant. And, it's very clear, certainly not only President Trump's remarks, but the Secretary General of NATO up in Ankara was pretty much backing up what President Trump was saying as far as the necessity for these latest strikes, but also going so far as to say that he saw the necessity of what the U.S. did on February 28th with Israel, and especially in what he sees as the actions of the Iranian regime reflected throughout, to include this current period. I just thought that was interesting to have the Secretary General of NATO actually weighing in like that. Hence, all of that being said, I think we're going to see some more strikes to come. There may be pauses here and there, but I just don't see the Iranian regime turning over a new leaf. I don't think they really quite get it. I think they certainly, from the MOU, their impression is great. If the U.S. is desperate enough to agree to this, which honestly, a lot of the MOU looked like it was written in Tehran without any changes, that they could get away with a lot of stuff. And certainly their behavior to date makes it very clear they've thought that. So with that said, I think we're going to see more kinetics. We're going to see some higher oil prices, and we're going to see some effects across the board in the economy. Thanks for listening to Strat. Also, you can go to stratpodcast.com. You can go to my YouTube channel, see my various news media appearances posted at Hal Kempfer TV. You can also go to my website at www.gripsa for Global Risk Intelligence and Planning, gripsa.com. And if you want to hear me for a very long period of time, you can go to the Infraguard Los Angeles website at www.infraguardlosangeles. That's infragardlosangeles.org. And you can sign up for the Dark Skies. That's where we're going to talk about all sorts of things like electromagnetic pulse from nuclear weapons. We're going to talk about coronal mass ejections, other threats to our electrical system, grid system across the board. That's coming up on July 15th. And you can also listen to an encore of the Gray Zone Threats webinar, and that's going throughout the month of July as well. So July 15th for Dark Skies and throughout the month for Gray Zone. Anyway, I hope you take advantage of that as well, and I hope you tune in for the next one.